So thanks very much for joining us today. It's our great pleasure to have Shenjing, Professor He Shenjing from Hong Kong University to give a lecture. So Shenjing, he's a very well-established professor in urban studies, and she has many titles. So in addition to the professor of urban studies in the Department of Urban Planning, she's also the director of the Social Infrastructure for Equity and Well-being Lab at the Faculty of Architecture. So today she's giving us a talk with title Loft-living under State-led Financialization. Thanks very much, Shenjing, to give this lecture. I would like to encourage people to type the questions in the chat box when Shenjing is giving her presentation. We probably have like 15 minutes to 20 minutes for Q&A. So in the last, in the Q&A session, so people are encouraged to turn on the camera and the microphone to speak out their own questions there. All right. Given the time is quite according to our experience, we need give more time for the presenter. So Shenjing, please, you can start sharing the screen.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to joining this FinGeo online seminar. I have been following the seminar series and sometimes I have to watch the video because of the time difference, but I really enjoyed it, this seminar series. So it's a great honor to share with you one of my ongoing research today. It's a joint author paper with my PhD student who has done the empirical investigation mainly. So today's talk is entitled Loft-living under State-led Financialization, mainly looking at adaptive reuse of industrial buildings for long-term rental apartments in Beijing. So this is the plan for today. First of all, I will try to talk a little bit how loft living is related to gentrification and how to enable a full understanding by positioning into the literature of fifth wave gentrification. And then we'll look at the case of China by looking at the rise of long-term rental apartments underwritten by state-led financialization. And finally, I will move on to the Beijing case. So first of all, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this book, Loft-living by Sharon Zukin, published in 1989. So basically, after this publication, a lot of scholarly attention has been attracted to this conversion of industrial building or industrial land into trendy urban spaces for cultural and creative industry or for residential uses. But of course, because this concept has traveled across space and time, it has different manifestations in different locations and also in different time periods. And also many people would argue that it has a natural connection with the literature of gentrification because of the upgraded built environment and also because of the typical middle class or creative class this loft living have attracted to those redeveloped urban areas. So by that, in that sense, in order to enable a fuller understanding of loft living and its evolvement over time and space, I would think we should position loft living into the literature of gentrification to understand it as an urban transformation that embedded in the complex urban processes, which has produced multiple centrality by reinvesting in those dilapidated post-industrial urban areas. And also if you reproduce and producing new forms of inequality because of the natural attraction to some middle class and the creative class. So in that sense, the way of thinking of gentrification is highly relevant to the study of loft living as well. So I'm sure you are familiar with this literature, this particular paper published by Jack Hackworth and Neil Smith in 2001, mainly based on gentrification, the evolvement of gentrification in the US context. And more recently, scholars propose two more new waves of gentrification, the fourth wave by Loretta Leeds and colleagues, as well as the fifth wave by Manuel Albers. So in this two latest wave of gentrification, two key features are highlighted here. The first one is, of course, the very strong state involvement, either through policy intervention or through different forms of involvement, like such as financial deregulation, re-regulation. And another key feature is the process of financialization has been deeply involved as a driving force for gentrification, particularly in the fifth wave gentrification, which has channeled in a huge amount of capital into those already gentrified areas to produce the so-called re-gentrification in urban areas, and also to through the operation of platform economy such as Airbnb to trigger a process of touristification and also transformation investment in some global cities. So I think this, by situating Loftliving in the fifth wave gentrification will definitely enable us to understand the latest development and latest form of Loftliving in different contexts. So in here, I will focus on the Chinese case. And again, state involvement and financialization. These are the two key features when we look at the newly emerging forms of Loftliving in the Chinese case. But first of all, I would like to give you an overview of the latest political-economic transformation in the Chinese context. So as always, the state has played a very important role, a dispensable role in tackling some major economic and social issues in the Chinese context. And in the recent decade, the state intervention are mainly dealing with two types of crisis. One is economic stagnancy. After 2008, after the global financial crisis, the economic boom has went into a stagnancy, and which also is linked to the withering of the so-called export-oriented industrialization model, which has sustained the economic growth in China for more than 3 decades. But it has entered a bottleneck, so it has to be stimulated to looking for new wave of capital accumulation and economic growth. And the other crisis state intervention is trying to deal with is social crisis in terms of housing affordability and social discontent associated with enlarging inequality. Again, this alludes to the limit of land-centered accumulation that already dominating the economic development in major Chinese cities for more than 4 decades as well. So in dealing with these two types of economic and social crisis, the central government has proposed two major policies or schemes. The first one is to encourage the development of long-term private rental apartments to enhance tenure security for people who could not afford the housing prices, especially in those megacities like Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and so on and so forth, since 2016. And secondly, in a number of large Chinese cities, the first-tier cities, they have entering a stage of post-industrialization. Most of the manufacturing function has transferred to other third-tier cities or even to overseas, to Southeast Asia. So post-industrialization and those vacant industrial buildings and brownfields are another major problem that the central government trying to deal with, which is through encouraging adaptive reuse of industrial buildings. Because of the very complex property rights issues, they cannot simply cannot simply change the land use attributes by reclaiming the land use right from the sitting tenants, which are usually the powerful state-owned enterprises. So instead, they would encourage adaptive reuse by encouraging temporary use or developing them into different types of residential, commercial, or different uses to reactivate the economic vibrancy in those brownfields. So apparently, in order to achieve these two goals, that will require a heavy investment. So in order to encourage and leverage private investment, the state mainly introduced two innovative financial tools to enable the development of long-term rental apartment and adaptive reuse of industrial building. And sometimes these two can be combined together, which is the focus of today's talk, Loftliving through developing long-term rental apartment. So these two most important financial tools include specialized corporate bonds, which allow qualified real estate developers to issue bonds even before the long-term rental apartment were developed. So enable them to accumulate financial capital from the market to inject into the land redevelopment and land development processes to produce long-term rental apartment. And another tool is asset-backed securitization. This mainly applies to developers who already obtained the first bucket of gold from the rental businesses, and then they can issue the securitization in order to further sustain the future development in long-term rental apartment. And currently is also under heated debates whether the Chinese government should introduce rates real estate investment trust to support the long-term rental apartment development as well. But currently it's mainly applied to infrastructure investment, but not yet being introduced in the realm of residential development. But these two financial tools seem to be quite effective in terms of the number of developers that actively responded to this policy since 2017. So as you can see, 2017 actually reached the peak time when 2/3 of the top developers, basically all top 10 developers already participated in this long-term rental market through different forms. So there are three main incentivization that attract the real estate developers into this market. First of all, of course, to improve their financial liquidity through issuing specialized corporate bonds and ABS. And secondly, after more than 4 decades rapid urban expansion, as you know, many Chinese cities actually are facing the problem of land scarcity, and also land prices has rocketing up. It's difficult and highly costly to obtain new land to develop either residential or office or commercial buildings. So in order to sustain a stable cash flow in facing of land scarcity, so those developers are also looking for alternative solutions and alternative ways to expand their rental businesses. So this is another incentivization. And finally, for many developers in the Chinese context, it's important to maintain a good relationship with the local government as well. In the future, they can easily obtain the land redevelopment rights. So they know this game quite well, and they all respond to this call from the central government actively. So these are two figures showing that the major financing sources for long-term rental apartments in China are coming from through financialization products. One is equity financing, and the other one is corporate bonds and also ABS. especially for ABS, you can see after 2015, it was on a rapid rise until the whole country or the whole globe was hit by COVID in 2020. So let's move on to the specific case of Beijing. Beijing, as the capital city of China, it has a very strong industrial base back in the 1950s. So currently the city has about 30 or even higher % of existing buildings are belonging to industrial building, and most of them has been vacant. As I mentioned earlier, it has gone through a process of post-industrialization, transferring those manufacturing functions to third-tier, fourth-tier cities and overseas. So in general, in major Chinese cities, the existing stock of industrial building has taken up an exceptionally high percentage of the buildings in cities, in megacities in China. So on average, 30 to 40% of the buildings actually belonging to industrial buildings, compared to 8% in the US and 15% in OECD countries in general. So in increasing or enhancing the land use efficiency has become a major task or major concern of many Chinese governments, including Beijing. And in another special condition about Beijing is trying to scale down the so-called non-capital functions by removing functions or land uses irrelevant to being the capital of China out of the city itself. So it became an urgent task to introduce some policy incentivization to reuse, to reactivate those vacant industrial land. So it was under this context, Beijing has published several documents to encourage the adaptive reuse of industrial building. The reason why they don't simply redevelop, revamp the entire brownfield and turn it into business center or mixed-use district is because of the very complex property right issue. As I mentioned earlier, most of those industrial land was allocated to state-owned enterprises, especially the central state-owned enterprises, what we call yangqi in Chinese. Those are very powerful players. They even have a stronger bargaining power compared to the Beijing municipality. So it's very difficult to relocate those state-owned enterprises. That's why the Beijing government has to settle a deal with those SOE in order to reactivate those brownfield. So a compromise solution to this complex property right issue is to introduce a TOT model to redevelop the industrial land, transfer, operate, and transfer. First of all, the state-owned enterprises will transfer the land use right to private developer, usually based on a 10 years contract, which is renewable. If the profit can be sustained on the long run, it will be renewable. And the central and local government mainly play a bridging and enabling role by offering the financial tools I mentioned earlier, corporate bonds and ABS, and also some preferable policy to encourage the development's involvement in adaptive reuse. So today I will look at a particular case in Beijing called Longfor Goyo. Longfor is a leading real estate developer originated from Chongqing. Chongqing is one of the biggest city located in Southeast China, and it has developed into one of the top developer nationally. So Longfor is famous for its rental businesses. So rental business has become one of the biggest proportion in its overall portfolio. So it also a forerunner in the long-term rental apartments that advocate by the central government. Currently is the top one in China which has developed over 65,000 flats across 32 cities, mainly in the form of transforming the entire building into residential and long-term rental building, which is different from the some platform that rent away apartments from different neighborhoods and then use them under the same brand to advertising online, which I will briefly mention later on. But anyway, Longford is one of the biggest developer in promoting these long-term rental apartments in China. So it was also the very first real estate developer approval by the central government to issue specialized corporate bonds. In December 2017, it has issued this special corporate bond worth of 5 billion RMB. So this is the first and also the biggest corporate loan specialized for the development of long-term rental apartments to finance this development in different cities across China. And later on, a lot of developers tried to follow the path of Longford, but many of them lack of the experience of developing long-term flat, and many of their application actually has been turned down by the government. Also because the proportion of long-term apartment development only take up a very small percentage in their overall business portfolio. So let's look at this specific case called Goyo Apartments. By the way, Goyo is a brand name under Longford for long-term apartment development, mainly targeting at young professionals. So this project is called Goyo Apartments Asian Games Village Branch, located in Beijing. It has turned a rundown industrial building totaling almost 10,000 square meters, built in 1992, into a apartment building with heavy investment into renovating original buildings. So the ownership still held by the China Metal Corporation, which is again a very powerful central state-owned enterprise. So China Metal rented the 3 buildings to Longford for 10 years, which is also renewable depending on the profitability. And this renovation project also won a number of very important prizes, including the Riyadh Global Design Award, the Jingrui Residential Science and Technology Award, which make it a flagship project for a Loft-living long-term apartment redevelopment. Currently, it offers over 300 apartments. You can see the size of those apartments are quite small, ranging from 19 to 27 square meters, only targeting at young professionals or young couples from the nearby job centers. So as you can see, it's located in the within the 4th ring, between Wangjing and Yaao. So these are the 2 very important job centers with a high concentration of IT and creative industry workers. So on the map on the right, you can see in the surrounding area, there are quite a few the so-called cultural and creative industrial zone, including the very famous 798 Art District. So as you can see, the targeted tenant are mainly from the CCI, the creative and cultural industry, and IT industry, and so on and so forth. So this table was obtained from our fieldwork through some insider informants from the Longford company. So this actually the projection from their bidding material when they bid for the adaptive reuse of the industrial building. So the plan was price for those long-term apartments was set at a very high standard, much higher than the surrounding areas, which was priced at over 60,000 RMB per month, and with those tiny units less than 30 square meters. And also it was projected it would increase by 10% yearly for the first 4 years and 3% for the 5 to 10 years. And it also has some co-working space, and with 3% yearly increase projection. As I mentioned earlier, it was mainly targeting at professionals from the adjacent areas, and the occupancy rate was estimated at 90% at the beginning, but of course this was not met. This estimation was too high, but later on they changed the strategy by turning the long-term lease into short-term or more flexible rental period. You can rent it for several months, 12 months, less than a year, or 2 years. So most of the renters actually prefer the more flexible rental period rather than long-term rental period. So the facility is mainly through renovation to retrofit a few mixed-use facilities tailor-made for those young professionals, such as providing the communal working space, the gym, office, entertainment facilities, shared kitchen, and so on and so forth. So these are a few before and after pictures. So you can see these were the original building. And by the way, the Beijing government actually required all the developers not to change the original structure of those industrial buildings because of the ownership and property rights issues. And later on, the developer retrofit some new functions into these 3 buildings, and also turn the vacant land in the middle into some office space and public space fitted with entertainment and some other uses, including cafe, bookstore, gallery, and so on and so forth. These are the interior design, which is very fashionable and attracted to the professionals and creative class in the surrounding areas. And these are the communal space, library, and cafe, gym, and so on and so forth. So what are the costs for this very attractive long-term rental apartment, or loft living, to be precise? Ironically, although the original intention was to enhance tenure security for those people working in the IT industry and in the surrounding work centers, but the reality is the tenure security has been worsening, mainly because of the more flexible rental period. Although some renters, they did prefer the flexible rental period, but this also allow the developers to raise the rent quite easily. Because of the high turnover rate, they can easily raise the rent, leading to the fluctuated rental prices, and eventually worsening the tenure security, and they can kick out the renters if they are not satisfied with the rental price. Somebody else will replace them. Also, it has a very obvious exclusionary effect by rising the housing prices, not only in the apartment building itself, but also in the surrounding neighborhood, even pushing up the housing price and rental price in the entire city. And secondly, it also excludes families and elderlies. Although this Goyo case is slightly different from other similar cases, they did allow family with children to live in those apartments, but most of those long-term apartments actually do not allow families with children or elderlies, which were considered as the non-productive labor. This alludes to a very strong productivist logic behind these rental businesses. So overall, I would argue this loft living model has worsened the housing affordability crisis rather than mitigating housing affordability crisis through financialization. And if we move beyond the Loft-living case itself to look at the general development of long-term rental apartment in China and beyond Beijing, we can see many real estate developer has taken advantage of the policy loophole, as I mentioned earlier, to usher in a rapid process of financialization of rental housing in Chinese cities. And many of them actually do not really use the financial capital they accumulate through those financial tools, ABS and corporate bonds, to engage in long-term development, long-term rental apartment at all. They mainly use that, exploited that as a tool to enhance the economic gains and also to improve the liquidity of their business. And also, as we know that those financialization process comes with very high cost, either through issuing bonds or ABS. It also takes a long time to recover the cost. So who will borne those costs? Of course, it will be borne by the renters. Usually, these long-term rental business are aiming at around 25 plus profitability. So it's relatively high compared to some average rental businesses. So this high cost has transferred into the rapidly rising rental price borne by the renters, even though those belonging to the relatively wealthy or middle class renters. This also producing an exclusionary effect, pushing out those low-income migrants who the Beijing and Shanghai and other Chinese megacities are trying to get rid of. So basically, this rising rent has been purposively used as an exclusionary tool to push out those unwanted labor. So finally, although in our case, we do not really look at the platform corporate landlord, but this actually is the highest risk is associated with the platform economy, which can be seen in the recent collapse of Danke, which is a famous online platform company for long-term rental apartments. It was also listed in the New York Stock Exchange market, but it became a big scandal last year. Right after it became a listed company, it declared its bankruptcy because of the burst of the risk that has been transferred to investors, landlords, and the renters. So it bears a huge risk associated with the financialization process, and also sending alarming message to the government that trying to encourage long-term rental apartment development through financialization. Finally, to conclude, we can see by situating Loftliving into the fifth wave gentrification, by looking at the important role played by the state as well as the connection with the financialization processes, we can interpret this Loftliving case as the result of entrepreneurial governance by employing creative financial tools. And we can also see a very strong productivist logic embedded in this housing provision process by introducing long-term rental apartments. And secondly, the central and local state also employ innovative financial tools to leverage private investment. So finally, it also fits into the theoretical framework I proposed in 2019 in other publication, looking at the development of creative and cultural industry in Shanghai, which is the creative spatial temporal fix in post-industrial Chinese cities, because we can obviously observe that the development of long-term rental apartment is trying to fix the creative asset or investment and the creative class in the urban built environments through adaptive reuse by producing tailor-made rental housing for the creative class. And it was enabled by a creative form of capital expansion via financialisation as well, along with spatial restructuring. Although the original structure did not really change at all, it was mainly through adaptive reuse. And finally, the purpose was to defer or conceal the potential accumulation crisis associated with post-industrialization, and also to magnify the surplus in the short term. But whether it can be sustained in the long run still remain questionable. And meanwhile, it also transferred the high risk to more vulnerable groups, including individual landlords as well as the renters. Okay, I will stop here. I hope I did not take up too much of your time, and I welcome any questions or comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shenjing. So the good news I would like to share is today we have the largest or the biggest audience ever, the 5th seminar. So congratulations to you, Shenjing. Now we have questions. So people you can still continue to type your questions in the chat books. But now I'll start to let people who have done that one by one. The first, Karen, could you please turn on your microphone? Yes, please, Karen.
Thanks very much, Fenghua. Thank you, Shenjing. That was really interesting. It wasn't so much a question. I was just wondering out loud, right? Because when you were talking about how there's a preference for short-term lease, whether that has to do with the nature of the job market, because you said that many of these apartments are specifically targeted at young professionals working in and around those cities, those job centers. And has there been some shift in the nature of labor market conditions such that they're attracting people who have shorter, right, kind of work commitment, and therefore they want these kinds of shorter lease because of project-based work that lasts a few months and not kind of long-term job commitments, which then kind of led me to think about the current debates around working from home, hybrid working, and whether that will change right after the pandemic, even when we get over this. So if hybrid working then becomes more of a norm, would people then have start to shift and have a preference for then again longer leases because you are not expected to be moving around as much in terms of working conditions? So sorry, it's just kind of rambling thought from your slides, but thank you. Very interesting.
Yes, thank you, Karen, for the question. You are quite right by capturing the key features of those renters who are mainly working on a project-based contract or short-term or more flexible contract-based creative workers. So I suspect that's why the main reason we have done a few interviews, but not we are actually planning to do a wider scale interviews or possibly a questionnaire survey to find out the real reasons for why they prefer a short-term contract. But you are quite right based on our limited conversation with the renters. But I am not sure about whether this will turn into a long-term preference for long-term lease contract because of the working from home norm or the changing working pattern in the post-COVID-19 situation. Perhaps Fenghua knows better because he lives in Beijing. But I guess most parts of China has returned to normal and people start traveling, and Fenghua is actually on a business trip, I suppose. So people started to move around regularly. So I guess this might not be a main reason for people changing their preference for long-term lease, but more fundamentally, change would be for those people who have moved up the job ladder or the social ladder. When they secure a more stable job, they would eventually prefer a more a long-term lease. And in that sense, I would think this flexible lease rent, short-term lease has been exploited as a way to exploit the flexible and creative labor who are usually at the entry, who are actually at the first or the entry level jobs. So also because I mentioned earlier, they also exclude families with children and elderly, right? So actually they are specifically targeting at this very flexible and transient type of creative labor. Yeah, so in that sense, it has even a deeper exploitative nature embedded in this so-called long-term rental apartments. Actually, it does not really practice this so-called long-term rental at all. Yeah. It has been purposely turned into shorter term.
Thank you, Shenjing. Now, the next question from Wang He. Hello.
Oh, okay. I see He's question.
Yeah.
Yes.
But
Hi,
please,
Shenjing. Thanks for the talk. I think she answered my question already. I'm just curious how it's the rule, and also in terms of consumption, these families is, I think, is considered as a top productive family composition in China nowadays. Thanks.
But I guess this has to do with the lifestyle they are trying to promote. So one of the key terms they employ in advertising the Goyo Apartments is they call itself to create a city hub, which means they would like to bring in a very vibrant and energetic and restless type of lifestyle suitable for the young professional rather than families. And also, as you can see from the interior design as well as the communal space is purposefully designed for the younger cohort without children or elderly. And also for the reason I just explained, they are more easy to be exploited as a flexible kind of creative labor. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Thomas, you have a question, right?
Oh, I was just wondering probably what others were wondering, which is given the highly speculative nature, if short-term leases can go up very quickly, they can also go down very quickly. So is there potential for a bubble, or is there some sort of higher level mechanism to prevent that?
Perhaps not for the case of Beijing. And again, Fenghua knows the demand in Beijing is huge. As I said, if the tenant is not satisfied with the raised rent, they can leave anytime, and somebody else will take their place. And also because of the location of the case that we are looking at, it's has a very strategic location between two major job centers, full of IT young professionals or people engaged in creative industry. So I would think it will not create a bubble, at least not in this specific case. But if you zoom out, you look at other smaller cities, it's possible to have such a bubble. It cannot increase as the projection I show in the table, that you cannot sustain such a increase 10% or 3% yearly, right? So it has to has a ceiling or a cap that constrain this the increase of the rent, right? So yeah, in terms of the macro prudential measures, yes, in some cities actually, for those long-term rental apartments, some cities actually set an upper limit for these long-term rental apartments, because originally the purpose for developed long-term rental apartments is mainly targeting at the so-called working class. So in the document that we obtained from the Beijing government, it says it should redevelop into dormitories, but dormitory has different definition, right? So although on paper it should develop into dormitory, but the interior design, the renovation can also upgrade this dormitory into a trendy home preferred by the young professional and IT industry workers as well. So basically, the government has this plan in mind. It depends on how they implement those policies to regulate the increase of rent and also keep that under control and slow down the housing price increase in the long run.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, still we have about 15 minutes for questions and discussion. So please, if you have questions, please just type your question or just turn on your camera and speak out your questions directly. So so I have a question for Shenjing, quite relevant to Tom's question. That is, do you have any sort of statistics about the overall supply of this kind of long-term housing, and do you have any estimates on the trend of the size of this new type of housing in the long run or short run? I mean, so how this kind of increase the supply of this kind of housing will affect the housing market in China. So yeah, just I'm curious about this kind of statistics and in the future trend. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the very important question. So ever since President Xi gave a public speech about housing is for live, not for making a profit, right? 房子是用来住的，不是用来炒的. Ever since he made this famous claim publicly, I think the Chinese government at different levels took it very seriously by encouraging the development of rental market. So the case we are looking at in Beijing is only, I would say it only takes up a very small proportion among this vast scheme of promoting private rental market in the entire country, and even in Beijing, it takes up a very small proportion. Other options could include develop long-term rental housing on the collectively owned land, the village land, right? The land owned by the village collectors. And also in other cases, it will involve the redevelopment of some rundown urban areas, old urban neighborhood as well. So I would say the adaptive reuse of industrial building takes up relatively small proportion, but it's important too, because as I said, about 30% of the existing building stock are belonging to industrial buildings. So Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou government are actually encouraging the adaptive use of those buildings as well. But whether they will be developed into a long-term apartment or use it for commercial or creative industrial use, it really depends on individual cases. Yeah, but I would say overall rental apartment will be a trend, but perhaps we should look at other cases as well, especially the collective land, the case of collective land, which will become a very important type of long-term rental apartment development in many Chinese cities.
Thank you, Shenjing. Now we have more questions from so Liam, could you turn on your camera? Yes, please. You raise your hand. I see it. Please. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for the great talk, Shenjing. It is really interesting and surprised that the state has a direct role and impact on exclusion and othering. So I'm wondering, is there any social discomfort or challenges from civil societies about the young professional couple excluding other population in that apartment? And is that discourse easily accepted by Beijing people? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. I would say not to the extent we would expect, because mainly because of these exclusionary rules was presented in a very subtle or soft way, because it would not say, okay, we cannot rent this housing to people above the age of 60 or with young children, but they will set a lot of rules. For instance, if they don't provide any facilities for child rearing or for age-friendly facilities, then those people would not come. And also the rental price and also the size of the flat would not be suitable for those family groups as well. So basically they set up a very soft and subtle waves of exclusion. So that's why it has not confronted by opposition and some other discontent yet. And also another reason is because there are other options for people with families and elderlies in the market. Yeah.
Okay. Yunpeng, you have a question, right? Could you turn on your camera?
Yes. Hello,
Great.
Shenjing. Thanks
Hi.
for this very interesting talk. I hope I understood the arrangements between the local state actors and the developers correctly. In one of the slides, you mentioned that the initial contract between them was for 10 years and will only be renewed if the project proves to be financially viable. So I'm just curious how this viability actually was defined and how these temporal arrangements between the state actors and the developers have kind of impact on how the developers divide their business model, for instance.
In fact, the government did not directly involve in the contract arrangement. It was between the state-owned enterprise. But if you consider the state-owned enterprise as the state, but you said it's local state actors. The local state actors actually, they were only monitoring the process when the developer and the state-owned enterprise try to settle a deal. They will set up a few rules. As long as you follow their rules, and they would not look into further details. And what they really care about is the use of the adaptive renovation, because they have listed a few specific uses for the renovation of industrial buildings. For instance, they would say it can only use for dormitory, or it can only use for office space, or for some very specific uses they think should be given the top priority. So in terms of the business model, whether it's profitable after 10 years, as I show in the table, right? That table is actually not the actual figure. We were not able to obtain the actual profitability and their business conditions at the moment, because it was considered as a business secret. But the table was from the bidding material. This is something they present to the state-owned enterprises as well as the local government to convince them this is definitely financially viable and it's profitable. That's why they project at a very high increasing rate, a very high occupancy rate, which they actually failed to deliver. But anyway, they managed to have a break-even point, and also after winning a few prizes, this project become very famous and it attract a lot of renters. So it would not be a problem for them to fill all those flats, but whether it can be sustained after 10 years is still quite questionable.
Thank you. Still, we have about 5 minutes left. If people have more questions, please do it. Otherwise, we will have a social networking session after the seminar. So the link is in the chat box. Please click it later, after the seminar. So you have more questions here? Okay, great. So thanks again for Shenjing for your great
Thank you.
talk and a really insightful and a big congratulations for this big audience today. So yeah, welcome you to join us later in Wonder Me session after the seminar. Just click the link. Very very friendly.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, user friendly. Okay. Thank you very much for joining this seminar today. Thanks for Tom Stigler, my colleague in organizing this seminars. Our next seminar will be on July the 13th, Tuesday again, the same time. Okay. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you so much. Very good questions.
Bye-bye.